Well, my background began, I had sort of a nominal Methodist background where we weren't really insisted upon believing certain things. We went to church, but it was more of a social thing. It wasn't a religious thing, really. So I didn't have that. And my parents were very open, like, you find out what's right for you, you study the things that you want, and so on. And throughout my teenage years, I started to realize the sort of hypocrisy and inadequacy of the biblical religions that were on offer. And I became what people call a seeker. I was looking for, like, what is the truth? What are the answers to these problems of life, and so on. And through a very long story that I tell in my book, is I became a Taoist, a very devout Taoist, because it was a sort of a miraculous experience that converted me to the supernatural worldview of Taoism. And I took up the Tao Te Ching as my Bible and defined my life by it. I actually created my own Tao Te Ching by taking my favorite translations from different Tao Te Chings and wrote them in a diary as my one devotional literature in boot camp. And they allow you one thing to read, and it has to be a religious devotional literature. So I had my own personally transcribed Tao Te Ching with me. And I was like that through my years in the Coast Guard. And what happened was, during all this time, I was always studying science and studying all the sciences, all different fields, and very much interested in that. And as I went through my mystical experiences as a Taoist, while also reading up on the science, and also reading Confucianism, which was the sort of opposite of Taoism. The Taoists and the Confucians sort of argue against each other in Chinese history. And so I started to realize that the Confucians had some good arguments against the Taoists, and the Taoists had some good arguments against Confucians. And I started to realize that there's something, I can't pick one of those. There's something, a higher truth to that. But then while I was reading science, I started to understand that the mystical experiences I was having had scientific explanations. It's just natural hallucinations. And you could just go down the symptoms list of all the causes and everything. And so I realized that I was being misled, essentially. And that's what really finally, and at this point I was sort of a doubter then. I didn't know what to believe. But I was still kind of a committed Taoist. And I was on a naval training base, and a Christian came up to me and said, "Hey, have you found Jesus?" And I explained to him that as a Taoist, it didn't matter whether God existed or Jesus existed. It's irrelevant. We all have to follow the Tao anyway. Even God and Jesus have to. And this was very frustrating for the Christian apologist who'd never encountered this thing to argue against. But he said, "Well, you really can't make a decision until you've read the Bible." And he gave me one of the student NIVs, and I said, "Well, okay." Sure, I'll read the Bible. And so I literally just read it cover to cover, Old Testament and New, all the way through. It took me maybe a week or less because amongst classes and so forth on the naval base. And once I finally finished it and turned the last page, that's when I declared aloud in my room, "Yep, I'm an atheist." Because it was just so absurd, and it was so more barbaric and out of touch with reality than Taoism was, and yet I knew Taoism was wrong, so it was even worse than wrong, the Bible. And that's when I realized, okay, so I'm an atheist. Am I the only one? And at this time, this was back in 92, or 91 or 92, there wasn't a lot of atheism. It was very hard. There was no atheist section in bookstores, certainly. Rarely were there any books on atheism in bookstores. You really had to look hard to find them, or even to know. So you go around as an atheist thinking you're the only one, and how can I be the only sane person? Is everybody crazy? And eventually, in an old bookstore, I found Bertrand Russell's "Why I'm Not a Christian." I found Corliss Lamont's "The Philosophy of Humanism." These are these old books. And eventually, at the Castro Street Fair in San Francisco, where I was going to with some of my friends, there was a booth by American atheists there, and I said, "Oh, American atheists! That's me! I'm American. I'm an atheist." So I ran up there and got all their literature and joined American Atheists. And back at that time, American Atheists, I didn't like the way they were running their operation. They've changed a lot since then, but back then I didn't. And then I found Freedom from Religion Foundation, switched over to them, and I've been a loyal member of FFRF ever since. But it got me into a whole network of atheist literature, atheists around the country, and of course online, the internet exploded around this time. And so then I got involved in online movements and debates and so on. And some of my articles got onto the secular web, and then I got roped into being a feedback editor for the secular web, and then editor-in-chief of the secular web for a few years. And so I learned a lot. That's really plugged into all the networks of atheism there, and all the different kinds of arguments, pro and con, and everything, and all the literature. And that's through all this process, I was trying to find the right philosophy, the correct worldview. And I realized there wasn't one yet. No one really had the package deal. But I read a lot of different philosophers, from positivism to objectivism to Marxism. I mean, all these things. everybody had a little bit of something that was right or something that was wrong. And so I realized, well, I've got to sit down and start from basic principles and build one up. And what I ended up with is metaphysical naturalism, what we call metaphysical naturalism, where nature is all that exists. You can explain everything that way. There isn't really any need for any other explanation. Morality, epistemology, all of it comes from the basic principles of natural causes without any intelligent design. So there aren't any spooks or ghosts or supernatural minds involved. There's no disembodied soul. And once you can construct a worldview that way using all that we've learned through science, everything fits really well. In fact, better than any other worldview does. And it explains a lot more and is a lot more useful in interpreting things and coming up with new solutions to problems. And that's how I became a metaphysical naturalist. Well, the first benefit of adopting a naturalistic worldview is that it gets you plugged into the truth. That's the primary thing. If you want to solve problems, if you want to know the correct attitude, the way to navigate life, the best way to pursue your own happiness, the best way to solve political and social problems, you got to have the facts. You got to have the correct information to start with. And religion isn't going to give you that. Naturalism at least sets you in the right direction, and if you follow the right methods, you'll get the right facts and you can start that way. And that's the first place to start. And you could say even religions might offer hope or escapism and so forth, but those things actually distract you from solving your problems. If you want to solve your problems, you have to face that you have problems. You have to actually accept the facts that you have problems. Naturalism forces you to do that. And one of the examples of that is for facing your own mortality. A lot of religious believers are shocked that I don't think that I'm going to live forever. And they think, how can you think that? Isn't that depressing? And no, I've thought about it, and it really isn't very depressing. I mean, it's a bummer. I mean, I'd love to live longer, but I don't need to. It's not like my current life is diminished in any way by the fact that it's only going to be a short period of time. In fact, it makes it more valuable because there's less of it. And once you face your own mortality and you realize death doesn't scare you, you don't have fear of death anymore. If death is not scary, that opens up a lot of other avenues towards pursuing your own happiness. It takes a big monkey off your back. And I think you can really move forward as a person once you accept your own mortality in that way, where you don't depend on this fantasy of living forever. And naturalism, of course, throws you right into that mindset. So it's going to send you on the right path to that. So that's another benefit, and that relates to the whole idea of putting you into touch with the truth. And then all of the other ways that religion can be used to manipulate or mislead you. A lot of religious people, in fact, I would highly recommend Matt Taibbi's books about he did one thing where he infiltrated a Christian organization and pretended to be a convert, and it was one of Hagee, is that the guy's name? Tom Hagee, or I can't remember his first name, but he's got this huge network of churches in the South, which he uses as a big vehicle to control politics. So he basically uses a bunch of cells of these Christians to disseminate his political propaganda, and he actually designs it just so the little committees, little prayer meetings, the leaders of the prayer meetings guide the discussion in the direction of the political views that he wants people to feel or in order to control their vote. That's an example of where if you don't know that's going on, you won't even know that the conversation has been being manipulated to sort of convince you to vote a certain way. If you don't even know that, you're just a puppet, you're just a pawn. When you know that, however, then you start to question, well, is what he's telling me what I should be believing? Am I just being manipulated? Is he right? Is he wrong? Then you start to think for yourself. And then that's where progress can be made socially, is when individual voters start to think for themselves and don't let religion manipulate them. And as a naturalist, there's not going to be there's no divine authority. There's no one that can just stand up and say, this is the truth, you better believe it, or you're going to hell, for example. That's not going to happen. They can threaten, like, society's going to go to hell, but you go, well, that's a factual claim, we can test that. So naturalism actually gives you the toolkit and gives you the mindset to actually think for yourself, and in a way that religion does not. And you can't really use naturalism to manipulate and control people. You could use religion to do that. So that's another benefit of naturalism. And there's probably many more. I'll bet if you ask several other people, they'll come up with other reasons why. I've sat down on various occasions and listed different reasons, but those are the main ones. Yeah, of course, I've had this debate with a lot of philosophers in terms of how you even define what you're talking about. Like when you're talking about morality, and philosophers will define it in different ways. I define basically the question what you really want to know is what you ought most to do. So basically, it's the question of what is the overriding imperative in your life? For all the things that you ought to do to accomplish certain goals, what's the one that overrides all of those, that can't be overridden, that doesn't have any higher ordinance or any higher duty? When you're pursuing it in that sense, and of course this is something that even naturalists debate still among themselves, but I've taken a particular approach to this, and I'm arguing it formally in coming literature and in my past literature as well, where I argue that there is a particular objective moral truth in the sense that there is something that you ought most to do, and you'll discover what that is once you're aware of all the facts that you need to know what the answer is. And to give you an example, the Christian, sort of generic, popular Christian view is that you better follow the Ten Commandments or you go to hell. That's a very naive, very simplistic version, but there are a lot of Christians who say that and have told that to me to my face, so I know that a lot of them believe this. Christian apologists are annoyed by this because they think it's more sophisticated than that. But even their more sophisticated versions break down to the same thing, that it's you will follow these rules or your personal life is going to be totally screwed. And it's all about the individual's own pursuit of self-interest. Christianity is fully that way. All religions are that way. They all appeal to the individual's self-interest. How can life turn out best for you? The only thing is they invent a sort of future life that you can't see to confirm that what they're telling you to do will get you there. And then they give you this list of rules. So that's how they control you. They say, follow these rules or you'll go to hell. Of course, we can't prove that there's any connection whatsoever between whether you follow these rules and you go to hell, or even what hell is like. Even that hell is bad. We don't know anything. We can't point to anyone there. We can't, we haven't sent any probes in there to take photographs. We don't know. Whereas naturalism says, well, hell and heaven are what you create socially and individually here in your world. So, for example, drug addiction is an example where you might want to pursue that pleasure of that high, but in the long term, it's going to completely screw your life. You're going to be way worse off if you try to pursue a drug addiction than if you just stay off drugs or avoid drugs completely. And that's a simple, sober, plain, objective fact of the world. It's not an opinion. It's not anything. It's an actual fact of the world. Your life is going to suck more if you start taking drugs than if you don't, certain addictive drugs. And that's a fact. And so naturalism, the whole moral view of naturalism works that way, that there are certain attitudes you should embrace, certain habits you should cultivate, certain behaviors you should follow in order, in the long run, to make your life better, to make you a happier person. And two of the things that come out of that shake out of that process of analysis is compassion and honesty. If you cultivate in yourself compassion, that means an awareness of the feelings of others and how your actions affect them. So you're not indifferent to people. You can actually understand, I hurt that person, or I know what it's like to be hurt like that, or I know what it's like to be happy like that. And when you share someone's joy, someone's happy with you, you make someone happy, you share that joy, that you actually experience a form of happiness that you would not have experienced otherwise. And there are many different ways. We've demonstrated through psychology and sociology that compassion and living a compassionate life and having that compassionate mindset makes your life better in every conceivable way. And honesty does the same thing, that ultimately, in the long run, it's like drug addiction. You might think lying to get out of something, you will pursue that immediate high, that immediate escape from some discomfort, whereas in the long run, it's going to make things worse. Whereas if you were honest about it, it might be a little bit more painful immediately, but in the long run, it's going to be better off. Even when telling the truth destroys some aspect of your life, you can rebuild your life then, at least knowing that you've been honest, and you can build on that, and you can actually have the self-respect and self-confidence that honesty gives you. And so living an honest and compassionate life actually is in your own best interests. It creates a better society, which makes a better environment for you to live in and pursue your own happiness, and it gives you the better inner life that you can enjoy your life. And there are many other aspects of this, of how pursuing particular moral directives makes your life better, and through social interaction and through your own internal mindset. And that's what naturalism, I think, can teach us about how to be moral. Yes, bringing up this idea that morality as a science is something that I've explicitly advocated in my book in 2005, in Sense and Goodness Without God, where I say specifically we should call it ethicology, or call it whatever you want, but it should be pursued scientifically, and I even lay out the scientific research program necessary to pursue it and get the facts we need to actually identify moral facts. Sam Harris is coming out with a book called The Moral Landscape. He argues exactly the same thesis, and he argues it from the perspective that he's a cognitive scientist, an actual scientist, and who's saying, we can make this a science, and here's how, and here's why. And he's right. Everything he says in there is correct. And so I've taken it from the philosophical perspective, he's taking it from the scientific perspective, and there are many other philosophers who are joining our group, and other scientists as well. Scientists who study moral psychology are also on our side. So there is a growing movement. We just need to actually make it happen. And I talk about this in my book, but I'm also going to talk about it in a book coming out called The End of Christianity, edited by John Loftus. And I have a chapter in there where I actually present the thorough formal argument, including at the end of it are several pages of deductive syllogisms demonstrating my point, so that there's no excuse anymore for philosophers to sort of weasel out of this conclusion that it should be a science, we need to make it a science, and that's the only way we're going to move forward. And I think naturalists should all be behind that. Yes, progress is absolutely possible, and a model to look at in moral science is psychology. Look how freaking long it took to make psychology a proper science. So there was this 2,500 years of philosophical debate about the nature of the mind and the nature of the soul and nature of emotion and all of these things. It wasn't really until the early 20th century, and you had people like Freud who at least started the scientific thinking. They were wrong about almost everything, but they at least got the questions and answers right and started making it a science. Then you had Singer, went a little bit too far the other way, and then you had various other psychologists getting in, and you had this sort of synthesis grow. And it took about, I'd say it wasn't until about the 80s that we actually started having real good science in psychology, where the conclusions that psychologists were reaching were very rigorous and very useful. And then you had cognitive science, where we were connecting all these things to structures in the brain and the way the brain works, and we understand tons more. I mean, a vast amount of detail now about how the mind works and the nature of the mind. And that was 60 years. It took once it began, and it began only in the early 20th century, so it was a really late starter in the history of science. So, but we haven't even done, it's obvious we haven't done this for morality. There's no ethicology department at any university, so we haven't even started the science. So, like psychology, when you start it, you're going to start making progress in understanding of morality, just as we made progress in understanding the nature of the mind. It might take 60 years to finally get a really good, solid basis for the science, but you have to get that process rolling. So what are we looking at, 2070? If we start this year, we'll have a fully developed moral science in the year 2070. Well, of course, meaning is something that a mind creates. There is no meaning apart from minds. So before we existed, there wasn't any meaning or purpose, because that's a senseless concept without minds present. When we existed and became conscious and could start creating meanings, having purposes, and we have individual personal purposes, like I want to eat today. So the purpose of my task is to get food, or is to pursue happiness. So you actually have that. And we got to the point in philosophy and intellectual thought that we realized that what we want most out of life is to be happy, to experience happiness, to experience our consciousness in a way that doesn't distress us. And that it makes us feel good things and great things, and learn more and understand more and be more conscious of the world. These are all things that bring us happiness and contentment and satisfaction. And that's what we realize that's what we want to do with our lives. So that's the meaning and purpose of life, is to do that, because there isn't anything else to do that's worth doing, really. I mean, that's the one thing that actually makes our lives satisfying, and actually makes being conscious and being alive worth the bother, really. And when you do that, that's what you find. So meaning and purpose comes from within. It comes from what you want for yourself. And when you think about it and you analyze it and you study it and you go around talking to people and exploring the world, you're going to come pretty much to the same conclusion.